What is going on, gum fighters? Today we're going to talk about handgun bullets, a little bit about history, a lot more about how it's relevant today to different handgun bullet selections. Some of this will also apply to rifles, but I'm mostly thinking about handguns. Handgun bullets. Right, bullets are important. Bullets are the one thing, no matter how much you spend on your gun's finish or accessories or whatever, the bullet is the thing that hits the target and does the damage. So I don't want to downplay the importance of that. Don't spend all your money on, accessories and widgets and no training, number one, and no good, well thought out bullet selection. Okay, with that, welcome to the podcast where we talk about guns, gunfighting, tactics, ballistics, the right way, biblical, Judeo-Christian values, and real-world first-hand experience. First and foremost, I'm a Christian, a servant of God, and a follower of Jesus Christ. If you would like more than that on my bio, there are bullet points in the show notes. All right, let's get started. Once upon a time, or long ago and far away, there was a round ball. A round lead ball. These were shot out of early hand cannons, later hand guns, matchlock, flintlock, percussion cap. That's really unimportant for today's discussion. They were round lead balls. Minié, often mispronounced mini balls, they're invented by Minié. As far as I know, the first mass successful elongated bullet design. Better than a round ball. But even some of the early revolvers, right, they were called cap and ball revolvers because they used a percussion cap and a round ball. But right around this era, Civil War era, you started to see longer projectiles. Not that there wasn't, small arms experiments before that, I'm sure there were, but I'm talking about mass adoption. It wasn't long before this got adopted into handgun bullets as well. Some of the early bullets, you just want to think about like the candy, a gumdrop, but made of lead, a deadly gumdrop, but kind of that same shape, right? Round-nosed cylinder. Gives you a little bit more weight for caliber than you'd get out of a round ball. A little bit better in-flight characteristics or external ballistics if you want to get fancy, and generally better terminal performance on target. One of the reasons the Civil War was so deadly is that these new projectiles, not in handguns but mostly in rifles, just were much more devastating than previous firearms and ammunition combinations were. Also, with the advent of breech-loading firearms, you could have an oversized bullet, meaning it could get squeezed down into the size, which made it much more effective, instead of having to be smaller to be rammed down the front in a muzzle loader. This applied to both handguns and rifles. But anyway, once you got that kind of round gumdrop shaped bullet, a lot of the early, like 45 Colt and things like that would have been that. All the way, if you look at even the original 45 ACP, which was, obviously 1911. So basically just a round gumdrop shaped bullet. Now I've heard that people did things like experiment with cutting X's in the front of the bullets. I remember as a child I did this with handgun bullets, cutting an X in the front of them. Whether it does anything or not, I don't know. But lead is pretty soft and easily malleable. Well, with just regular lead bullets, and these can be effective. Let's get into a little bit more technology here. Pure lead is pretty soft. Like we talked about, you can cut it pretty easily. You can push it in with your fingernail if you want to. It's pretty soft, especially as far as metals go. Things were done to harden it. Hardening it can decrease deformation, which may or may not be desirable, but it can also decrease leading in the bore. This becomes more important as you gain in velocity. For something like a 45 Colt or a 45 ACP, not that big a deal. But when you start getting much faster, you start seeing leading. You can start seeing leading in the rifling in the bore of your firearm. So this is what's called a hard cast bullet, when you add some kind of other element, tin, linotite, something to the lead to make it harder, hard cast. And you still see this today. This is popular in like Magnum handgun bullets where you're pushing that velocity for the leading, and also you may want to decrease deformation, the opposite of what you might think of in like a modern defensive hollow point, because you want deep penetration. And if the bullet expands, the more it expands, the less it's going to penetrate with the same energy. It's an inverse relationship. The bigger the front of that gets, the less it's going to penetrate with the same energy. An easy analogy would be if you thrust at somebody with a cylindrical object. You get big enough, it won't penetrate the skin at all. But if you get small enough and thin enough, it can go completely through a person. A really small, stiff piece of wire, even though you're applying the same amount of force. The larger the frontal diameter of that object, the less it's going to penetrate. Same principle applies with a bullet. So you may want a hard cast bullet so it penetrates deeper. So a hard cast does kind of both those things, decreases leading and decreases deformation of the bullet. Once you get up to a certain velocity, though, even that's not enough, and you might see something called a gas check, which is just a punched out piece of metal on the back of the bullet so that the hot gases and everything don't start melting the back of the bullet and giving you problems there. Generally only applies to Magnum handgun bullets. Well, I think the wad cutter came a little bit later, and wad cutters originally came out, as far as I'm aware, for cutting holes in targets, for competition, for cutting neat holes in targets. If you don't know, shooting competition, kind of the standing rule for any competition I'm aware of, if you break the line, it counts as the next highest point. So let's say you're shooting for a 10. If you break the line of the 10, it counts as a 10. So for competition, you want a nice clean hole as big as the bullet, as big as it can get. You see where that's advantageous. Well, I think people discovered that those also do better disrupting tissue, because they, disrupt more tissue and cut more things, do better terminally inside the target than a round nose bullet. A round nose is kind of the worst thing that you want as far as terminal performance goes. Now, a big hunk of lead going in you is bad either way. But you might think of a wad cutter like a soup can, a really small soup can flying out of the end of a handgun bullet. And these are still around, and they're still mostly used for target shooting in competition. Generally in revolvers. There are some semi-autos designed specifically to feed them, but mostly in revolvers because feeding is not an issue. Well, I don't know if Elmer Keith designed the semi-wad cutter, but there is something called the Keith-style wad cutter. If you're familiar with those terracotta pots, I know that audio is not always the best for this, but like a planting pot, if you consider something like that with a kind of cylinder, flat-fronted cylinder with a small cone with a flat front on it on top of it. This was kind of seen as an improvement for terminal performance and better than just a standard target wad cutter. This is called a Keith-style wad cutter for Elmer Keith. These are still popular today, and these gained a good reputation, and I think for good reason. They are a good bullet if that's what you're looking for. But we're still just talking about lead bullets. There are many coatings. Once you started getting out of the black powder era and started pushing bullets faster and faster with things like the advent of the Mauser cartridges, 7x57, 8x57, you started going beyond the velocity at which lead bullets were practical. Even hard cast lead bullets, even gas checked bullets, you needed to coat them with something because they were screaming at such high velocities. Now that velocity is going to change depending on rifling and bore diameter and things, but let's just say around 2,000 feet a second, which pretty much any of the more modern bottleneck cartridges are going to be past that. They wanted to coat them with copper, and I say copper, copper is a pure element. It's probably some kind of copper alloy, but copper jacketed bullets. Well, for the same reasons, cleaner, easier on the bore, these just became commonplace in handgun bullets. Copper jacketed bullets. Full metal jackets. These are still the most common handgun bullets today. You buy bulk 9mm, you buy bulk 45 ACP, you're probably getting full metal jacket. Back to that round nose gumdrop full metal jacket generally. There are other things, but these are the most common. These are good for cheap range fodder. that you can shoot a high round count through and not, really get a dirty bore. You could shoot a lot more of these full metal jackets through a gun than you could shoot lead before you got issues. Now, although it came much later, there is another coating that does a similar thing, and this is going to be the earliest one I'm aware of is called N.R.A. I forget who came out with it. It's an old N.R.A. logo, but basically plastics. When plastics became popular, not as good as a copper jacket for most things, but as you might imagine, pretty affordable. And you'll see, I think, a lot more smaller, more boutique companies making plastic coatings. Just because I think the barrier to entry to coat something in a powder polymer, like a powder coating, often called a powder coating or a polymer coating, is much less than it's a pretty involved process. There's not many home hobbyists making full metal jacket bullets on their own, but not nearly as hard to make your own polymer coated, N.R.A., whatever you want to call it, coated bullets. I have dealt with casting lead. I have bought and reloaded polymer coated ammo, but I've never done it myself. But from what I understand, the home hobbyist can do it pretty readily without a huge barrier to entry. So you'll see those a lot more smaller companies doing the N.R.A. clad or polymer coated bullets. Now there is limitations to this. They're better than a lead bullet, but you get to a certain velocity where they're probably not going to hold up. And this brings me to another coating that I think is often confused with full metal jackets, and this is plating. Plating is not the same. It's not the same process. It's basically the same elements. It's some kind of copper alloy, copper plated bullets, but it's much, much thinner. If you were to cut the cross section of many full metal jacket bullets, the copper jacket has some thickness to it. It might seem very thin, but it's going to be several times thicker than a copper plated bullet. Think of it, not exactly, but think of a copper plated bullet more like a paint thickness, like if you were to paint a bullet copper. It's very, very thin. And these will do the same thing as a full metal jacket bullet, sometimes for cheaper, but only to a certain velocity. You get up to a certain velocity and you can strip off that copper plating, where a full metal jacket is really not going to run into that issue, especially in any handgun. So you've got your polymer coating and your copper plating, which are good affordable options, but they only go up to a certain velocity. That's going to depend on the manufacturer. But it's somewhere generally, let's say around 1,200-1,300 feet a second. For most handgun calibers, 9mm, 45 ACP, it's just fine. Well, I don't know when the hollow point handgun round was invented, but I believe they started becoming popular in the early 90s. Not that long ago, but remember how I said that kind of that round nose gumdrop shape, which most handgun bullets are, is kind of one of the worst for terminal performance. It'll work, and one of the good things about them is they feed very easily. And a lot of the earlier generations of semi-autos, they weren't designed to feed hollow points, and they may not feed hollow points well, like an original 1911 without, a built-in feed ramp. Some of them will, some of them won't. An original, 1908 Luger, those weren't designed to feed hollow points. So a full metal jacket round nose feeds pretty well. Well, somebody wanted better terminal performance. They wanted the bullet to expand. They wanted less penetration, more expansion, disrupt more tissue, because handgun bullets are, no matter what caliber, I don't care what kind of caliber warrior you are, for any practical handgun, handguns are much less effective than rifles and shotguns. Just look at the numbers, it's not even close. You're very limited. You don't carry a handgun because it's super effective. You carry a handgun because you can have it on you and it's convenient. No military sends their frontline infantry into combat with handguns. They send them in with long guns. They're much more powerful, much more effective. And again, you could go to the extreme, but that's the exception proves the rule there. They wanted to increase the lethality of these handguns. So, again, the hollow point Super Veil was the earliest one that I can think of that was real popular. Obviously, once that technology started gaining traction, all the big companies started coming out with hollow point technology. Again, very recent when we talk about the, life of the handgun, even the repeating handgun. About repeating handguns, 1850s, 1860s, with common revolvers. I know they predate that by a long shot, but like common mass-produced things. And then we go all the way up to like the 1990s for common use of hollow points. So that bullet will expand and do more damage on the target. But just like we talked about earlier, when the bullet expands, when it increases that frontal diameter, it's going to penetrate less. But in a lot of, let's say modern conflicts where it's people against people, you might want less penetration because you just want enough penetration to do damage to the target and not penetrate through the target. A general full metal jacket bullet for most common calibers, 9.45, unless it does some weird thing with a bone or something, it will generally go through a person pretty speedily and keep going. A hollow point not only does more damage to the target, which is advantageous because you shot the target for a reason, but it also decreases the chance it's going to go through and cause damage beyond the target, beyond the soft target. Now there may be some straight lead hollow points. They're not common. These came after full metal jackets were common, so they're mostly going to be jacketed hollow point bullets, JHP, jacketed hollow points. These can be very simple technology, basically just a jacketed bullet with a hollow nose. Another addition that came not long after that was scoring in the jacket. You get these nice pretty petals. Not all handgun bullet hollow points have these. They're not always necessary, but they can be an improvement. They can give more uniformity to the way in which that hollow point expands. You get these nice pretty petals that look like a flower of death. Or a scored jacketed hollow point. Normally won't even, it'll just say JHP, but you can see the scoring in the jacket. Well, sometimes when these hollow points hit a target, they can either fragment or they can just lose the jacket. The jacket can separate. You may think this is a good thing. You may not, because the handgun bullets are generally small and less effective than other more effective bullets. So you may want the bullet to stick together. This is where you get bonding. There are different kinds of bonding. There's like electrochemical. There's the chemical kind of bonding. There's mechanical bonding. One kind that I can think of very obviously mechanical bonding is Remington Golden Saber black belt. It literally has a belt around the bullet to stop the jacket and stop over expansion. It's literally got a mechanical belt around it. So there are different ways in which to bond. I don't want to get too nerdy into that, but to kind of keep the bullet together in one piece. Because when you start shedding off pieces of bullet, you start shedding off mass. And the more mass you shed off, the less the ability of that bullet to penetrate. Now, we just talked about you may want less, but you get to a point where it's not enough. And that was let's say one of the idiosyncrasies with early hollow point bullets. They hadn't really got that balance right yet where you, again, it's that inverse relationship with expansion versus penetration. You got to balance that out pretty well. It comes apart too fast and you're not going to get enough penetration. Our vital organs, our important things are generally protected pretty well with bone and thick muscle and things like that. You have to get far enough in there to hit the stuff that matters to end a fight. So again, it's this kind of ballet dance, this symphony of expansion versus penetration. Because this is where you see a lot of these technologies. It's going to depend on caliber and velocity and things like that. Again, you may not want a hollow point at all. Depending on what it's for, you may want a hard cast semi-wad cutter. Also, there's a few other things that didn't really fit in so far. I try to do this fairly linearly as in the development of bullets, but it's not really like a line with a bunch of little stopping points, like where you start with the round ball and you end up with a hollow point. It's more like a tree, where you start with the round ball and it goes on for a while, then it branches off into a lot of different things. One thing I didn't talk about was semi-jacketed flat point bullets, where you have a copper jacket, but it's not a full metal jacket. It doesn't go all the way to the front of the bullet. You have an exposed lead area. Going back to hollow points aren't all the same shape, right? Even in the same caliber. A good example of this would be look at Spear Gold Dot. If you look at Spear Gold Dot, which is a very good high-performing defensive round, Spear Gold .147, 124s, and 115s, all in 9mm, have different shapes to the hollow point because they have to perform in different parameters or going different velocities. You could have a very deep, pronounced hollow point. You could have a very shallow, barely there hollow point. Or you could just have a flat, exposed lead front. Semi-jacketed flat point. You'll see these often in handgun hunting bullets where you want a little bit more penetration, some expansion. Again, you're trying to do that balancing act. So you might see semi-jacketed flat points with exposed lead. Also, I talked about the old school round-nosed lead bullets. Well, that's not the only bullet shape, right? There are different ways to skin that cat. And one of those is a truncated cone type bullet, where instead of a, rounding top, it has a cone shape with a flat point on it. A lot of bullets are like this. Since 9mm is by far the most popular handgun cartridge of our time, centerfire handgun cartridge of our time, defensive caliber of our time, you can see this a lot of times when you get to the heavier for caliber bullets. Not always, this is not an always, but generally if you look at the 147s, which is heavy for the caliber, you'll start to see more truncated cone flat point bullets. Whereas most 115 grains are going to be round nose. Again, there are exceptions, but that's generally true. One benefit to a truncated cone, in my opinion, I think the physics bear this out, when you have a flat front on a bullet, a flat surface, it tends to penetrate in a straight line better for the reasons that physics dictate. But on the downside, a round nose bullet is generally going to feed better. So you got to kind of figure out which one of those you want. There are gives and takes in a lot of things in the gun world. If one was always better, they would just use that one bullet profile. But there are truncated cone bullets. They tend to do well ballistically. They tend to do well as far as straight line penetration. Similar principle to the old Keith style wad cutters. And I just thought I would throw that out there. Another thing that's fairly new is what has many names, and none of those names are technically correct if we want to go down a rabbit hole. Solid copper bullets. Well, they're probably not solid copper. Copper is an element. It's probably not pure copper. It's probably some copper alloy, meaning it's copper mixed with something else. But, copper bullets, meaning the entire bullet is copper. It's not just a copper jacketed bullet. Another term would be monometal, but again, monometal would mean one metal. They're probably not one metal. They're probably copper and other metals mixed together to get the right consistency. Another term would be monolithic bullets. This also doesn't seem very accurate to me. The most applicable definition I see here when I look it up, massive, solid, and uniform. Well, why wouldn't that be a straight lead bullet? Why would a copper bullet be any more monolithic than a straight lead bullet? They're going to be the same size. They could be the same size, and the lead's going to have more mass. So I don't know what makes the copper monolithic. It's just a cool marketing term, I guess. But solid copper, monometal, monolithic. We're talking about a bullet that's generally lead-free. Why would you use these? Well, obviously, if you're shooting somebody, you don't want to give them lead poisoning. That would just be mean. But seriously, these are not just for hippies in California that hunt in Birkenstocks. Solid copper kind of became mandated for environmental reasons, for condors and other things that we don't have to get into politically. They do really well, actually, though, in some rifle rounds. They can have some real advantages in rifle rounds. I don't think we're there yet in pistol rounds. For handgun hunting, when you're pushing the limits of velocity, maybe. But you're still talking way less velocity than a rifle round. But they are out there. I wanted you to be aware of them. I don't think they're quite as proven as far as defensive handgun technology as are like a good modern, well thought out hollow point lead bullet design. But those are some different things that didn't really fit in the linear progression here I wanted to put out there. There's a lot more that we could get into, but I don't want to get too specific on any one thing. This was a generality of understanding handgun bullets and types. Maybe you already knew a bunch of this stuff, or all of it, but not everybody does. We got to remember we didn't pop out of our mom's womb with a ballistics manual. We learned it along the way, and people are on different parts of that journey. If somebody doesn't know, or they're walking around with full metal jackets and their carry gun, instead of berating them, just try and educate them, right? But especially for people that are just getting into, ballistics in the world of shooting, I hope this makes you a more informed consumer, not just buying something because that has a fancy box or a picture of something, or because it says defense or tactical, but actually getting the right thing for the right job. What is the end goal in mind? Which of these bullet technologies is most advantageous to you in your situation? Tactical verse of the day: He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. He sets me on high places. He teaches my hands to make war so that my arms can bend a bow of bronze. Thanks for listening, and have a blessed day.